In Flint, Michigan, the water flowing from thousands of household taps began turning brown, then greenish, with a strange smell that no one could quite identify. Residents reported skin rashes, hair loss, and asked their doctors whether it was still safe to use the water to mix infant formula. At the same time, a rare bacterium was spreading throughout the city, killing at least 12 people. In pediatric clinics, doctors began noticing something deeply alarming in children's blood tests. Lead levels, a toxic metal that can cause permanent brain damage, especially in young children, were rising dramatically, nearly tripling in some neighborhoods. For more than a year, city and state officials repeatedly insisted that the water was safe to drink. It wasn't. The reason behind it all can be traced back to an administrative decision made just months earlier, supposedly to save money. This is one of the most revealing cases of institutional negligence ever documented in the United States. If you enjoy investigations like this, now is a great time to like the video. It really helps the channel continue bringing you stories like this. Decades ago, Flint, Michigan, was one of the most prosperous cities in the state. It was the historic birthplace of General Motors and a symbol of the American automobile industry. But as factories gradually closed during the final decades of the 20th century, much of the city's economy disappeared, pushing Flint into a severe financial crisis. In 2011, the state of Michigan placed Flint under the control of an emergency financial manager appointed directly by the governor. The manager had the authority to make major administrative decisions without approval from the city's elected mayor or city council, all in an effort to cut costs and restore the city's finances. It was in this context that, in April 2014, the emergency manager approved what appeared to be a purely technical and financial decision. Instead of continuing to purchase treated water from Detroit's water system, Flint would begin drawing and treating its own water from the Flint River, a source that had long been known to be more polluted and much more difficult to treat. The city, whose population was predominantly black and where nearly 40% of residents lived below the poverty line, had virtually no power to challenge that decision. Within days of the switch, residents began noticing that something was seriously wrong with the water coming from their taps. The first complaints came almost immediately after the water source was changed in April 2014. People reported unusual discoloration, a strong odor, and a foul taste. The city issued boil water advisories after detecting bacterial contamination. Then, in October 2014, a General Motors manufacturing plant in Flint announced that it would stop using the city's water because it was corroding metal parts on the assembly line. That was a remarkable detail, considering that the very same water continued to be delivered to local families for drinking, cooking, and bathing. Residents brought their concerns to public meetings and held up bottles of discolored water in front of local television cameras. Even so, city and state officials continued insisting that the water was safe. In a symbolic moment widely covered by the media, Flint's mayor publicly drank a glass of tap water in an attempt to reassure residents. Behind the scenes, however, internal documents from the United States Environmental Protection Agency were already showing warning signs far more serious than anything officials were admitting publicly. For months, those warnings never reached the people of Flint. At first, officials tried to blame the problems on simpler and easier to explain causes. They pointed to bacterial contamination, byproducts from the water disinfection process, and old rusted pipes that supposedly needed routine maintenance. Each of those explanations accounted for part of the problem, but none of them explained everything. It was a combination of determined residents, investigative journalism, and independent scientific research that finally began to challenge the official narrative. One resident, Leanne Walters, who was deeply concerned about her family's health, reached out to Mark Edwards, an engineering professor at Virginia Tech and an expert in drinking water chemistry. He began independently testing tap water samples from homes across the city. At the same time, Flint pediatrician Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha analyzed hospital records and discovered that children's blood lead levels had been rising steadily ever since the city switched its water source. The two investigations came from completely different directions. One focused on water chemistry, while the other focused on children's health. Yet both reached the exact same conclusion. This was not just a matter of discolored water or a bad smell. A toxic heavy metal was quietly making its way into the drinking water, supplying the entire city. Once investigators uncovered the technical cause, the explanation was both simple and deeply disturbing. Water from the Flint River was naturally more corrosive than the water Flint had previously purchased from Detroit. To prevent that corrosive water from damaging the city's water distribution system, corrosion control treatment should have been added. It is a relatively inexpensive process and a standard practice for any responsible water treatment system. But that treatment was never applied. Without that chemical protection, the corrosive water gradually ate away at the inside of Flint's aging lead service lines. Many of those pipes had been installed decades earlier, when lead was still commonly used in water systems. As the pipes corroded, lead particles leached directly into the water flowing from household taps. There was no reliable way to tell by looking at the water how much of the invisible metal was present in each glass. The impact on Flint's children became the most heartbreaking chapter of the crisis. Lead is a powerful neurotoxin that builds up in the body and attacks the developing nervous system. According to medical science, there is no safe level of lead exposure for young children. The consequences include reduced IQ, learning disabilities, behavioral problems, and attention disorders. Many of these effects are permanent, even after the exposure has ended. Nearly 9,000 children were supplied with lead-contaminated water over the course of 18 months. Public health experts say that represents an entire generation exposed to damage that could affect them for the rest of their lives. At the same time, lower chlorine levels in the water, another consequence of the switch in water sources, created ideal conditions for the growth of Legionella bacteria. The resulting outbreak of Legionnaire's disease killed at least 12 people in the region during that same period. There was no single villain in this story. Instead, it was the result of a long chain of decisions and failures to act. The state's emergency financial manager, Darnell Early, approved the switch to water from the Flint River without ensuring that the required corrosion control treatment was in place from the very first day. Officials at the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, the agency responsible for overseeing water safety, downplayed and even publicly challenged the independent findings that pointed to lead contamination, despite having access to their own internal evidence suggesting that a serious problem already existed. An internal memorandum from the United States Environmental Protection Agency, leaked by an activist from the American Civil Liberties Union in July 2015, revealed that the federal agency itself had known about the severity of the problem months before any official warning was issued to the public. It was not until September 2015, nearly 18 months after the water source had been changed, that the city finally acknowledged the contamination and began taking action. Later investigations concluded that this delay unnecessarily increased the number of people exposed to lead. On December 14, 2015, Flint's lead contamination crisis was officially declared a state of emergency. The city switched back to purchasing water from Detroit, but by then the damage had already been done. Flint's aging lead service lines continued contaminating the water for years, until the complete replacement of the lead pipe system was finally finished more than a decade after the crisis began. The crisis led to criminal investigations that resulted in charges against 15 people, including the former governor of Michigan. However, only one person, a former state health director, was ultimately convicted. She received 1 year of probation, 300 hours of community service, and a $1,200 fine. Many Flint residents felt that the sentence was far too lenient, considering the scale of the harm. In 2021, a $626 million legal settlement was reached to compensate the victims of the crisis. Most of the money was allocated to families whose children had been exposed to lead during the most critical stages of brain development. To this day, Flint is recognized around the world as one of the clearest examples of environmental injustice in the United States. It is a case in which the health of a poor, predominantly Black community was sacrificed to achieve relatively modest government budget savings. The Flint water crisis was not an unpredictable accident. It was the result of administrative decisions that repeatedly ignored warnings from ordinary residents, independent scientists, and even officials within the government itself. Stories like this deserve to be told carefully, without exaggeration, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. If this story reminded you of something similar that happened in your community, let me know in the comments. It might become the subject of a future investigation. And if you want to keep following stories like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel.